inoculation, and that the environment is really important for that. So these diseases they'll have very particular needs and to infect the plant, to inoculate the plant. And then those pathogens, they can be dispersed lots of different ways. Just people, maybe with our pruning tools, like if you prune, a sick plant and you go prune a healthy plant without sterilizing your tools, that can disperse that pathogen. Sometimes just rain splashing on the ground and splashing the spores up to the plants. It could be wind, water, birds and insects. So then penetration is when the pathogen gets into the host. And so a lot of times that only happens through wounds. Like the oak wilt, there has to be a cut or some kind of a wound that damaged the plant to expose the opening for that spore to infect the tree. Sometimes they can get in just through natural plant openings like lenticels. Those are little openings for gas exchange. Sometimes they'll make their own way in. Sometimes these pathogens will have enzymes that can dissolve cell barriers and let themselves in. But usually a wound is the way they get in. So for example, we had a big hail here around Easter. I say a big hail. It wasn't as bad here as it was other places. I don't know if y'all had that storm Easter weekend. I covered my tomatoes, but I forgot about my little watermelon and my little cantaloupe that I had planted. And they're doing okay now, but they got beat up and had lots of holes in the leaves from the hail. And so the hail itself, just a few holes in the leaves, it's not damaging enough in and of itself to kill the plant or cause any real problems. But my main worry was there's all these wounds that it opens it up a lot more for diseases to get in. So if you have something like that, it wouldn't hurt to just give it a little spray of a garden safe fungicide for prevention. I didn't, I should have, but a lot of times diseases get into wounds when otherwise, if there wasn't a wound, it wouldn't have been a problem. Could also be animal vectors. That's just an insect or something that will feed on an infected plant and then go feed on a healthy plant, and it transmits it that way. So the infection, for terminology, is just that successful relationship for the pathogen. That pathogen is able to really live in the host. That can lead to the symptoms. And then dissemination is to continue that cycle. That pathogen really wants to keep going and keep spreading. So the pathogen can excuse me, overwinter in different plant structures, or it could create spores to blow or wash away to continue its life cycle. So just some more examples, just rain splashing or a storm, wind and rain splashing on the ground can stir up spores, insect vectors, irrigation runoff, seeds. If a sick plant makes seeds, the disease could be in the seed, and if that seed grows, it's already starting out with that pathogen in it. Infected transplants, it's important to only buy healthy plants, but sometimes the plant still looks healthy and it has that disease starting out. So keep an eye, buy healthy plants, keep an eye on them as they grow. Just stuff getting on your shoes or your equipment, stuff like that. Those are all different ways that the diseases can be disseminated. So plant pathogens, again, I kind of go back and forth between how a disease can be either infectious or non-infectious. And then also sometimes when we're talking about plant disease, we're really just kind of honing in on the infectious diseases. So as far as infectious diseases, something living that's making that plant sick, not environmental, those are mostly microscopic organisms. So fungi, bacteria, viruses, nematodes. But then there's also parasitic plants. Those are not microscopic, but there are parasitic plants, and I'll show you one of those. So fungi are considered the most important group because more plant diseases are fungal than anything else. 85% of plant diseases are going to be a fungal disease. And that's not, I mean, I wouldn't say it's a good thing, but it's kind of a good thing that most of them are fungal because we have more fungicides than, you know, we can't, there's nothing to fix viruses. So it's a good thing that most plant diseases are not viruses. And then bacterial diseases are very, very hard to treat. So with fungal diseases, at least we have a lot of fungicide options. Most plant diseases are going to be fungal. So they usually reproduce through spores. Those are tiny microscopic seed-like structures. And they need either a wound or a natural opening to penetrate into the host and take over. And then they can overwinter or oversummer as spores. And so overwintering or oversummering, that just means they kind of go into a dormant state and they just hang out until it's time, till conditions are good for them to keep infecting. Bacteria are single cells. They can enter through wounds or natural openings, and they reproduce themselves with fission. They can also overwinter. A lot of the symptoms are similar to fungi, but I'll show you something to look for to try and start telling the difference. I'll show you that here shortly. And then viruses are just DNA or RNA. And I'm sure y'all are real familiar with viruses now, with what's going on. I've heard a lot about viruses. They just want to get into a cell and take over the genetic information and replicate themselves. And so viruses tend to, I would say, mostly infect through a vector or through, you know, infected tools. So most of the time, plants get viruses from a vector. So an insect that feeds on a healthy plant, it takes that virus in. The virus doesn't hurt the insect, but then it goes to feed on another plant, and then it can transmit the virus that way. So nematodes are microscopic, tiny little roundworms. Let me see if I can remember the number right. I like to watch scientific YouTube videos, and there's a science channel, one of the PBS channels I was watching, and they were talking about the importance of nematodes. So just think to yourself, what's the population of the world? How many people are there? I think we're approaching getting close to 8 billion. We've got 7 billion, I think getting close to 8 billion if I'm correct. The number of nematodes and just individual microscopic or larger nematodes in the world, there are, I think it was 13 billion nematodes for every one person. So it's this massive number of these things. And then when our entomologist taught our master gardeners, he mentioned nematodes, and he said that, you know, they're just everywhere. We have them just on us and in us and all around us. He said that if you stripped away a person, you took away all of everything but the nematodes, you could still see an outline of that person because of the nematodes that were on them. So these things are everywhere, and most of the time they're harmless or beneficial. I just think they're fascinating because there's so many of them and they're so important all over the world. But there are some plant problem causing nematodes, namely root knot nematodes. Those are usually more of an issue in sandy soil, not really as much of an issue if the soil is not sandy. And I certainly don't have sandy soil, but I got some root knot nematodes a few years ago. I think they just came along with a vegetable that I bought. They were already in the root system of that or in the soil, and it caused havoc in my garden. But since I don't have sandy soil, over a few years, I've been able to reduce their numbers. But then we've got mistletoe. That's a semi-parasitic plant. It's called semi-parasitic because it does extend a root system into the tree. You can't just pull off mistletoe because it's growing into the tree tissue. It's going to just keep growing back out. And it does take nutrients from the tree that way. But mistletoe is also green, so it can do photosynthesis. Photosynthesis happens in the green plant tissue. So it can do photosynthesis. It just likes to also take from the tree. Mistletoe doesn't normally kill trees, but if there's a big enough infestation, it can stress and weaken the tree. And then dodder, this is a truly parasitic plant. It's not green. It's like a yellow pale color. It has no chlorophyll, so it can't do anything for itself. So this will sap what it gets only from the tree and cause tree disease. Well, it's not just trees, but this is an example of it being on a tree. And so it will rob resources from the host and weaken it over time. Okay, so a little bit more terminology. Recognize the difference between a sign and a symptom. A sign is the physical evidence of the disease. Like you can see with your eye, you can see the disease agent. Like you can see the fungal mat, mushroom. You can see the powdery mildew. You can see bacterial ooze. That's just you seeing the actual pathogen. A symptom is just, you're not seeing the actual pathogen, but you're seeing its effect on the plant. So maybe if it's a wilt disease like oak wilt or fusarium wilt, you're seeing the plant wilt, but you can't see the pathogen that's doing that. And so symptoms could be wilt, canker, leaf spot, things like that. You're just seeing the effect that disease is having on the plant. So just an example of leaf spot disease. Like I said before, bacterial and fungal diseases can often look the same, but one thing to look for that's different is bacterial leaf spots are generally going to be confined by veins, leaf veins, so they'll be a little more angular. So going back to that picture, if you can see, especially one of those leaf spots is kind of triangular, that's because it's been confined to leaf veins. And fungal leaf spots are not confined by veins, so they're not going to have that same angular appearance. They're just going to be kind of roundish, oblong, or just irregular. Otherwise, they're pretty similar. Fungal and bacterial leaf spot, they both have yellow halo. They may be random, or so just the biggest thing to look for as the difference would be, are they angular or not as far as leaf spot disease goes. So I'm just going to show you a few different common symptoms. These are just very broad symptoms. This is not a diagnosis. So I'm not sure if I have this point to make later, but it is important to bring up the point of if your plant has a disease, if it's a pathogenic disease, an infectious disease, it's so important to identify exactly what the disease is if you want to have success in treating it. And just saying a plant has a blight is not a diagnosis. You can identify that as a symptom, but it's not a diagnosis. So blight is just a symptom, meaning sudden death. Blight as a symptom means very quick, sudden death. So if you have a fruit tree like a pear, one day you're out looking at your plants and it looks fine. The next day, like one day later, you go out and there's a section of that tree that's just dead. Looks like it's burnt up, black, shriveled up. That's a blight. And so fire blight that's a diagnosis, because fire blight is a specific pathogen that causes blight, and it's pretty common in fruit trees like pears and apples. But just saying blight because your plant has a sudden death, if you want to have success for treating or preventing it next time, or just understanding how to control it better, you need to know what kind of blight, what pathogen was causing that. So a rot, that's another symptom. That's just decaying plant matter. It's going to be soft and rotting death. And then wilt, pretty, that speaks for itself, the plant wilting. Plant wilt diseases, they cause the wilt because the disease, the pathogen, it blocks up and plugs up the vascular system of that plant. So you have fusarium wilt of a tomato plant, or you have oak wilt of an oak tree. No matter how much water is available to the roots in the soil, the vascular system that transports that water to the rest of the plant is all plugged up by the disease so that it can't go where it needs to go. So you have the wilting and the death. A canker is dead tissue. It could be raised or it could be sunken in. It's just a discolored, distorted spot on the bark or the stem. And then you have galls. A gall is it's kind of like a tumor. It's the plant's own tissue, but it's growing in an abnormal, extreme way. And so there are galls that can be created by an insect, or there can be like bacterial galls where the bacteria infects the plant, and whatever is, whether it's an insect or a pathogen, it's the plant growing its own. It's the plant's own tissue, but it was triggered to grow in that weird, unusual, extreme way because of the insect or the disease. So then some non-infectious diseases. We'll talk more about these kinds of things, but maybe a nutrient imbalance. Maybe it's got yellow leaves because it needs fertilizer. Maybe it's not getting enough iron or enough nitrogen. Yellow leaves and poor growth, that is the plant, again, being not at ease, if you'll use that terminology, or it's just not functioning right. And it's not because it has a pathogen, it just needs the nutrition. So you could work on the soil, you could incorporate more compost to provide that nutrition, or you could apply a fertilizer to help fix that. It could be temperature extremes, toxic chemicals like herbicide drift. Maybe somebody was spraying a herbicide, but a gust of wind came up, or it was too windy and they shouldn't have been applying it and it blew over. Could be mechanical injury or pollution. Luckily, we don't really deal with many problems of air pollution here in West Texas, because we're not like Houston and Dallas with as much, condensed population. Or it could just be a genetic defect. For example, there's a genetic problem that can happen on tomatoes that causes this gold spot on the fruit. And then air pollution, that's just showing you a picture of what what kind of damage pollution can cause. So toxic chemicals, that's mainly going to be herbicide drift. Vegetables in particular are real sensitive to herbicides. So just be careful with any kind of herbicide application, because if it gets on the plants you don't want to get on, it can cause problems. It could just be a cultural issue, plant culture, cultural control, cultural management. That just all has to do with the care you're giving the plant, or planting it in the right environment. Sometimes plants just have transplant shock, and if you can do all you can to give it the right environment and take good care of it, but if sometimes plants, when they just go into a different environment, they're just not going to like it for a little while. And it's important to try and do everything you can to mitigate transplant shock. And if you are doing everything correctly, that plant can get over it over a little period of time. But if you're not careful to help the plant get over transplant shock, and then it's for your newly planted plant. If you're not taking that in consideration, you might lose that newly planted plant. So you have to water things more often when they're newly planted, and maybe give it a little bit of shade in the afternoon before you just expose it to full sun, things like that. Planting too deep can cause problems for trees and shrubs, things that are woody. Planting things at the wrong depth can cause lots of problems later on. Soil penetration problems. If your soil is compacted, your plant is not going to be able to grow very well or very healthily, and you can see stress and problems later on. Girdling roots, back to the woody plants, especially like trees. If you buy a tree that's been in the pot too long and the roots are circling, and you plant that tree, those circling roots continue, and over time they will girdle that trunk, and so that can cause lots of problems or even death eventually. Root disturbance. So maybe you have a nice mature tree in your yard that's always done really well and been healthy, but then maybe you had a plumbing issue and they had to trench a big deep trench through your yard, and if it was near the tree, that's disturbed a lot of the roots, and that can cause problems or stress, or even excessive mulch. Now, I love mulch. I always say to use mulch, but for me, often the kind of magic number would be 3 to 4 inches. It depends on, it always depends on what you've got, what you're growing, what you're using, but generally 3 to 4 inches of mulch won't cause you any problems. If you go deeper than 4 inches, you can start to kind of suffocate the soil and the roots. Air isn't able to get through it as well, and those roots need oxygen. So just plant care, how well or how poorly our plants are cared for, can have a big impact on them having stress and disease. So starting with disease diagnosis, first thing, it's really important to know your host plant. You got to know the plant. What is it? What's normal? What should it look like? What does it look like when it's perfectly healthy? Then if it's not healthy and it's not normal, look for those symptoms and those signs and see if you can tell any patterns. So just as just a personal observation of mine, infectious diseases are usually very specific. So there are some diseases that can be real broad and affect different kinds of plants. But for the most part, plant diseases are real particular. So I mentioned fire blight. Fire blight affects apples and pear trees and plants in that family, like Pyracantha. It's only going to affect a certain family or type of plant. Oak wilt only affects oak trees. It doesn't matter, if you took some of that pathogen and you tried to infect, a pecan tree, it's not going to affect a pecan. At least to my knowledge, with current research and current information, a lot of these diseases, these infectious diseases, are specific to the host. And so one thing that I've noticed, that if someone has several different kinds of plants, like very different kinds of plants, like they have one kind of a shrub that's having a problem, and then a tree is looking sick, and a couple of their different perennials are showing problems, very often that homeowner or client assumes that it's a disease spreading from plant to plant, and that's very often not the case. There's just not many diseases that would go from plant to plant like that. So if you see that situation, you can see a pattern that you can try and take other things into consideration. Like, for instance, one time I went to a yard that had, I think it was an oleander, and they had pittosporum, and I can't remember what else they had. These plants were all looking very sickly in the springtime, and it was freeze damage. Those were all plants that were more sensitive to freezes. So if the only plants showing a problem are plants that are on the marginal side of being hardy, and we had a real cold spell, even if it was just one day, if it got down to 6 degrees or something, a real cold snap, then that's the cause, most likely. There's not going to be a disease going from plant to plant, and they're not always going to want to believe you. It's a lot easier to think it's just a disease going, and they just want to spray it with the fungicide. They don't want to hear that it was a disease, a cold spell, and there's nothing else to do about it. But looking for patterns and thinking about the environment, what has happened lately with the weather, how is that being cared for, what kind of herbicides have been used. Lots of questions are good for plant diagnosis. And then we do have the Plant Disease Diagnostics Laboratory at Texas A&M. It's a really good resource. If you do suspect that it's a infectious disease, that it's a fungal or a bacterial disease, then you can pack up a sample of that and mail it to Texas A&M. It costs $35 for the basic test. And I believe I'll have time later to show you a little bit more about that. I have some slides to show you about how to take good samples and to send them to them to get the best results. But that is a really good resource to help with plant diagnosis. So just start by considering all the possibilities and then eliminate things that you can that are most improbable. Rule out everything that you possibly can. You know, ask questions about the history and just look for clues. It's like being a detective. You have to, you know, I wish I was Sherlock Holmes. Sometimes I could be a better diagnose plants better, but you have to question lots of things. So based on that, does anyone want to unmute yourself or put in the chat box what is this symptom called? So this is a wilt. I mean, it's pretty obvious the plant is a wilting. So just look, it might not, sorry, it's a little bit blurry. I need to try and find a better example of picture. But if you can, if it's not too blurry, kind of take in everything you can about this picture. Just imagine you're there in person, you see these wilted tomato plants. Look around the affected plants. Is everything wilted or just these wilted? So, I mean, you can consider environmental factors like heat. Sorry, what was that? So, you know, if every single tomato plant was kind of looking wilty and maybe the leaves were curling up, that can happen just from heat. So if it's really sunny, it gets really hot, plants will tend to just try and curl their leaves up to conserve water. Sometimes plants just look wilty, you know, at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, just because it's so hot and they're trying to conserve water. But then the next morning when it's cool, they might look fine. But since only some of these tomatoes are wilted, the surrounding ones are not, this is a symptom of a disease. So this is probably one of those tomato wilt fungal diseases like Fusarium wilt or Verticillium wilt. And you just need to remove those plants so that it doesn't continue to spread to the rest of them. Okay, so talking a little bit about disease management. So this is just a strategy that tries to reduce disease and the impact of disease. So we want to prevent pest damage, but at the same time, we want to have the least effect possible on our own health, on the environment, and other non-target organisms. So it's important to not just go crazy with overusing pesticides like fungicides and insecticides. It's important to try and develop a strategy to best manage the problem without affecting the environment or our health too much. So here are just some different ideas. Avoidance is one management strategy. So just avoid the disease in the first place by, for instance, geographic area selection, just choosing the right variety or making the right choice for your area. Certain varieties or types of plants may do better in one environment than another. You could time your planting better. Try modifying your cultural practices. Maybe if you're having, for instance, a lot of take-all root rot, I don't know if you'll have that where you are. We don't. So St. Augustine is a very popular lawn, and it tends to have an issue called take-all root rot. It's a fungal disease. But that disease in particular is real, it's called opportunistic. It's real opportunistic, meaning the pathogen is pretty much everywhere. Take all root rot pathogen. If any of you, well, like I said, I'm not sure how much you have it there, if you have it as much as we do, but for here in San Angelo, any person could take a sample of their lawn and mail it to the Texas A&M plant lab. They'll probably be able to see take all root rot pathogen in that sample. But whether that plant has that disease or not is going to depend on if that disease was able to successfully penetrate and infiltrate and create a successful infection. And some of the things that are favorable for take all root rot is excessive fertilizer and frequent irrigation. So if you're fertilizing a whole lot and you're irrigating every few days or more, then your chances of having problems with take all root rot in your lawn are a lot higher. So maybe you just modify your cultural practices and improve the environment for your plant and, you know, kind of make a poor environment for the pathogen as much as possible. Maybe go with early maturing cultivars. So for example, tomatoes, if you're trying to grow tomatoes and you start having issues in the season later as it starts to get warm, try growing tomatoes early in the season and use early maturing cultivars that you at least get a good crop before that problem starts coming back. Exclusion, that's another step for preventing or limiting disease. And just for one thing, make sure that you buy healthy plants. Just, you know, don't assume every plant is going to be perfectly healthy. Just take a look at it, inspect it. If someone's trying to give you a plant that you can see has an obvious problem, maybe don't bring that into your yard or your greenhouse or somewhere where it can spread to other plants. Plant quarantines, there are some like regulations. So I don't know if y'all are familiar with citrus greening, for example. The citrus industry is affected by this disease called citrus greening. And so they have rules and regulations about transporting citrus trees. Elimination of vector insects. So I don't know if many of you are familiar with rose rosette. Have y'all had any rose rosette in your area disease?
Yes, we do have some.
Oh man, sad. I haven't seen any in San Angelo yet, but I know it's in Abilene, and then it's there where y'all are. So rose rosette.
A tiny bit.
Just a little bit.
Yeah.
At least it's only a little bit. It's really devastating in the Dallas area. So the rose rosette virus is transmitted by this tiny mite. This little bitty mite is so small it just blows in the wind. And so we know that at this point we can't cure viruses. We don't have anything to spray on the plant to fix the virus. So the biggest step for preventing viral diseases, especially, is to control vector insects. So for example, grapes have a bacterial disease. What is that called? Pierce's disease. And so Pierce's disease is a bacterial disease. It affects grapes, and the same pathogen can affect other types of plants as well. And that disease is spread through, I think it's leafhopper insect. So it's a vector insect that will infect the grape plants. So if you are growing grapes and you're concerned with that disease, your main focus is going to be on controlling the insect. Now with rose rosette, unfortunately, those mites are so small, they just blow in the wind and go from plant to plant. And I think they're doing research on how to control those mites, but I don't know that they have made much progress on that yet. Another step is eradication. Just keeping things clean will go a long way. If you keep your tools clean, so sterilize your pruning equipment and stuff with, it could be 10% bleach solution, it could be rubbing alcohol, it could be Lysol spray. I know those are all in high demand right now, so you might not have enough to spare for your plants. But if you are Working on a sick plant, maybe. So for example, if your fruit tree suddenly has a branch that got fire blight on it, it is possible that so far, if you caught it quickly enough, it's possible that that disease is just limited to that branch for right now, and you could remove the branch, you know, prune further beyond any symptom or sign of dead leaves. But it's possible that you could save your tree by just pruning that off. But you definitely want to sanitize, sterilize the pruning equipment before you went and pruned anywhere else, just in case it was in that location where you pruned it. Destroy diseased plants or alternate hosts. So some plants have diseases that have two different hosts, and it kind of goes back and forth. I can show you an example later on of cedar apple rust. And so one season it's in one host and another season it's in another host. And so you can eliminate the alternate host to eliminate or reduce that disease cycle. Or if a plant is diseased, like if you have a tomato plant in your garden that has a virus, then there's nothing to do to cure that virus. So you eliminate the plant, you pull it up, you don't put it in the compost, you put it in the trash so that it gets away and gone from being a potential source of more inoculum for the other plants. Crop rotation is really helpful. Crop rotation is a big deal for vegetable gardening. You probably will have talked about that with your vegetable gardening class, I would think possible. But crop rotation, just not planting the same thing in the same spot every single season or year, can go a long way. So like I said before, a lot of diseases are real host specific. So if you plant your tomatoes in the same spot in the garden every year, and then you get some of the fusarium wilt disease going, then that's a soil-borne pathogen. Crop rotation, it helps with soil-borne pathogens and pests. It's not going to help you with anything above ground, of course, but for those pests, diseases, and insects that are soil-borne, they live in the soil, it can make a big difference. So if you have your tomato and it gets fusarium wilt, but you just keep planting the tomatoes in the same spot, that disease pathogen, it can really build up and start affecting your plant sooner and more extremely. But say, for instance, like okra is in a different plant family, or a watermelon, those plants are not susceptible to that pathogen, so you could plant those there and put your tomatoes elsewhere. And that pathogen doesn't have anything to feed on, and so it dwindles and it will reduce in number. And so crop rotation is a big, big help for vegetable gardening. Roguing, that is just referring to pulling out the sick plants. Don't leave them around so they can continue the cycle. And then protection, that's when we get to the use of fungicides and pesticides. So I want to go back to the point of this integrated disease management. It's kind of similar to IPM, integrated pest management, that we talk more about insect pests. It's pretty much the same thing for diseases. We want to use all these different resources to try and prevent, reduce, control these diseases without only using pesticides. Now, that's not to say that fungicides should never be used. Use them when needed, but just don't only rely on them as your only option. Consider all these other things that see what is possible for you to adopt into your plant culture to keep your plants healthy and prevent the disease in the first place if possible. And then, of course, use the fungicide when needed. Always follow the label directions. Maybe just modify your environment, prevent barrier, and put some barriers in place to infection. Like I mentioned, painting oak tree cuts, that's a barrier. Vector control, like keeping those vector insects managed, can help. We can also try and utilize resistance. So they do a lot of plant breeding, especially for vegetables, to breed in disease and pest resistances. It's not as common in ornamentals, but you can find it, like this picture here. You can see these seed packets. So the Snapdragon seed packet on the left, it says that it's tall rust resistant. So I personally don't grow a lot of snapdragons to ever have had that problem, but if you've had issues with tall rust disease, then you can choose a snapdragon that's resistant to that disease. Or tomato, we have a lot of options with tomatoes. I just as a side note, personally, I think we've lost flavor with plant breeding for heat tolerance and plant breeding for disease resistance. Those are great things, but I think a lot of a lot of the tomato varieties are kind of losing flavor, and I've been told that breeders are trying to breed flavor back in so that we get all of those good benefits, plus it still tastes like a tomato. But for example, this Better Boy hybrid tomato, it says VFN. When you see letters like that on a tomato seed packet or a transplant label, those letters stand for different things that is resistant to. So V is verticillium wilt, F is fusarium wilt, and N is nematode. So those 3 pests that can damage your tomato, that variety is resistant to. Doesn't mean immune. It does not mean that we'll never have a problem with it, but that particular variety is a lot better and more able to not be affected by those pests. And then the zinnia, it says first mildew resistant zinnia. So this zinnia cultivar or type is resistant to mildew. So there are things you can look for resistance. So then for therapy, this is kind of the last resort. It's really hard to cure diseased plants. Many of these diseases, you can't just easily spray it with something and okay, it's all fixed now. There certainly are some plant diseases that if you apply a fungicide, then you can recover it. The plant can recover and still function, but a lot of diseases are not just easily cured. So prevention and all of those other things we talked about are the most important. But when you do have disease, it's important to remove diseased plant parts. So like I mentioned with the fire blight and the fruit tree, you can prune off the affected branch and hope that it hasn't made it past that yet. Pick off the worst affected leaves. If a tomato has early blight, that's a fungal disease. The lower leaves start to look sick. You can pick off those worst affected leaves and then apply a fungicide or a neem oil or something like that to help it. That will reduce the source of more inoculum to keep spreading. You can treat it with a fungicide or a bactericide or something like that, but all those other methods we talked about are your best bet for reducing, eliminating plant disease. So just toward the end here, excuse me, I want to show you a few different common plant diseases. So Entomosporium leaf spot. This is a disease that gets on photinias. This particular disease does also affect Indian hawthorns. Again, like black spotted rose, the leaf has to be wet. So if you have Indian hawthorns or photinia planted like right up against your home and you don't have a gutter, and whenever it rains, it just washes all over that plant, and or if you have a sprinkler system that's spraying those shrubs every time, then that's more leaf wetness and you're more likely to have that disease. So if you keep the leaves dry, you won't have as many problems with this disease. So here's the black spotted rose, talked a lot about that. The leaves have to be dry. Whatever leaves fall, because whatever infected leaves fall on the ground, just rake that up and throw them away. You can use fungicides to help. And then oak wilt. If you suspect oak wilt, you can send a sample to the lab at A&M. It does, like I said, it does cost $35, but if you're really concerned, that's probably the best thing to do to know for sure if it's oak wilt. Don't prune when the beetle is active. Sterilize your tools. Don't buy red oak firewood, especially from an infected area like Central Texas, or if you do or you recently have, you can cover that firewood with clear plastic to prevent that from getting spread to your healthy trees. So here's a rust disease. So any fungal disease that is orange in color, that will have the name rust. So blackberry rust or cedar apple rust. There's a lot of different diseases that are rust, but the rust is just a term for if it's orange in color. And then powdery mildew there on the left, that's just a common foliar fungal disease. Just looks like you kind of sprinkled some baby powder on the leaf. Root rots can be really frustrating if you're trying to grow new plants, if you're propagating, if you're starting seeds, or you're rooting cuttings. When you're rooting cuttings, that's a wound. That's a big wound that is a really easy way for a disease to infect the plant. So when you're sticking cuttings and propagating, it's really important to have clean, sterile potting mix or medium so that you're not increasing the chances of getting a rot. So you use clean, sterile pots and use clean, sterile potting mix, and make sure your pruning tools are clean. Keep everything really clean and sterile when you're starting those cuttings, especially if you've had issues with the cutting dying and rotting from a root rot disease. Just a few more examples. So vinca blight is a Phytophthora disease, southern blight of yucca. So those are just a few common diseases. Just show you some pictures of what's out there. So again, you can see that bacterial leaf spot. You can see how the spots are more angular. They're confined by the veins. There's an orchard that's been severely affected by fire blight. Again, blight just means it happened very quickly. And so fire blight is a specific type of blight disease. And then on the left there, that's a bacterial leaf scorch. It's a Xylella, I think, is the bacterial genus that causes leaf blight. So some more cultural practices to try and help you. Crop rotation, correct fertilizer usage. Don't overdo it. You know, some fertilizer may be needed, but more is not better. More is just more. So use the right amount. Apply it correctly. Deep burial of crop residue. If you have leftover plant parts from your garden, it might help to till it in at the end of the season. So that if they were sick plants and they had something infected, if you deep bury the residue, then it can reduce that organism. Sometimes just planting on a raised bed can help with better drainage and better oxygen infiltration and help the plant be healthier. And it can, sometimes just planting on a raised bed can help you if you've had wilt diseases and soil-borne pathogens. Remove undesirable plants, just controlling weeds around your garden, not just in your garden or in your flower bed, but if you keep the area around your flower beds and around your vegetable garden clear and mowed low and maintained, that will eliminate a source of pests and, you know, vectors and things like that. So for chemical control, we have seed treatments, soil drenches, and foliar sprays. Use the recommended product and in the recommended amount. Just like fertilizer, if it needs some, more is not better, more is just more. So be careful with applying pesticides of any kind, fungicides. If you're applying a fungicide, use the right amount that the label says to use. If you use too much, you could risk scorching or damaging the plant tissue. It might not work as well as if you use the correct amount. Use the right timing. A lot of times it's better to apply fungicides on a cooler, cloudy day, not in the bright, hot, sunny, you know, summer day to help reduce plant stress. So here are just some different common examples for fungicides. Daconil is pretty easy to find. You can get Daconil at home improvement stores and nurseries and garden centers. So there's just a long list of different products that you can use. Let me see. So if any of you want, I can send you these slides or just these products to be emailed out later. So just to sum up this this portion of our lesson today, choose the right varieties. Give your plant the best environment. If it says that it needs full sun, give it sun. But remember, just keep in mind that if a plant says full sun at the nursery, it might not necessarily mean full West Texas sun all day. So if a plant says full sun, it could, many of the plants that say full sun could appreciate a little bit of afternoon shade. That's okay, but it does need to have a significant amount of direct sun. If it says full sun, it needs a significant amount of, like 6 to 8 hours of direct sunlight on it. If it says it needs shade, it's going to grow in the shade and it's not going to be successful in the sun. So just know your plant. Some full sun plants really need to be in the full West Texas hot sun. Some of our really heat and drought tolerant favorite plants, yeah, they do need that really hot West Texas afternoon sun. But other plants from the nursery that say full sun, they might appreciate a little afternoon shade. You just need to know your plant, get to know what it likes and give it what it wants. Select healthy plants in the first place, plant it correctly. Use mulch, but don't do it too deeply. Definitely don't volcano mulch around your trees. Don't get too close with the lawnmower to, rip bark off of your tree or anything like that. Keep things sanitized and clean. A really good thing that I hadn't said before was air circulation. Air circulation is really helpful for reducing diseases. So for instance, if you're growing roses or Indian hawthorns, those things that we talked about, the fungal leaf spot diseases, if you plant your roses with plenty of spacing and in the full sun, the air can blow all around and keep those leaves a lot drier. If you plant them too close together and you crowd them, the air circulation is not going to be as good, and you'll have a lot, you may have a lot more disease impact if they're planted too close together than if you give them good space. And of course, don't over fertilize, don't overwater, or you can improve the root environment. Maybe incorporate compost before you plant. Aerate with a pitchfork or with an aerator if it's your lawn. Improve the root environment to get oxygen. That can help. So again, as a master gardener, if somebody is trying to get your help to figure out what's wrong with their plant and how to fix it, just gather lots of information. Take notes of all the plants that are affected. What kind of pattern can you see there? Is it only affecting a certain type of related plant? Like if it's in a vegetable garden, is it only getting the peppers and the tomatoes? Because peppers and tomatoes are related. They're in the same plant family and have diseases that are common to them. But if something is affecting the watermelons and the cucumbers and the okra, then that's a whole different story. So try and look for patterns. What is the severity? Ask lots of questions about what's been done lately. If there's a stressed tree, if a tree is having a little bit of branch dieback, and I can't see any other obvious reason, then I'll try and figure out if they've used any weed and feed, for example, because some weed and feeds, if they have atrazine in them, those can be damaging to trees. So just ask all the questions you can. If you can look in the garage, or like one of our plant pathologists, Dr. Apple, said in a training recently, he said to try and get into their garage or their gardening shed to see what all they have in there. Sometimes it's a little hard to own up to things. So if you ask a leading question like, have you used weed and feed? They might just say no, or they might not even know that they did. They might have just thought they put down fertilizer and they didn't know it was a weed and feed. So it may be even more important to look at the actual products they have applied, if anything, versus just asking them what they've done lately. And what's the weather been like lately? Did we have a a super cold freeze in the middle of winter. Here, I don't know what y'all had last year where you are, but in San Angelo, we had an early first freeze. It got really cold kind of early for us. It didn't last very long, but it was cold enough and it was sudden enough that it caused some problems. So we lost some of our oleanders. We have some damage on crepe myrtles, things that normally aren't damaged by cold. You know, if a plant can take temperatures down to 0 degrees or 10 degrees in the winter just fine, that's one thing. But if it happens really quickly, like really early, if it happens in October and it gets colder than normal, and that plant hasn't had time to adjust to that cold yet, that can cause problems that you see later the next year. So the Plant Disease Lab, the website is no, sorry, that was the wrong link. I will look up the link for the lab. It's just, if you would like to submit a sample, I can show you more information about that later. But the link for that to get information is just plantclinic.tamu.edu. So it's just plantclinic.tamu.edu, and they can be helpful for identifying diseases. So that is the first half. We can take a break, maybe like a 5 or 10 minute break, so y'all can get a little stretch in or use the restroom if needed. And then if there are some questions, I could try and answer those.
Well, I'll take this training.
All right, so I'm just going to turn mine off for just a minute. So like I said, y'all get a stretch in, walk around if you need to. I will start back at about 10:15. We'll start back in at 10:15. Y'all ready? Okay, so I'm gonna go until 11. That's the scheduled time. But y'all get to pick what you want to cover. So I'll just show you what I've got. We did plant pathology. That's just the intro lesson. I have a slideshow called CSI. We'll just talk about different things that can happen to plants. I'll just mainly just show you some pictures and you can kind of guess or figure out what's wrong. We'll just look at some common landscape plant pests. I have some slides from Dr. Apple. He's a plant pathologist. He provided a training to agents recently about tree myths. So this would just be his tree myths that just focuses on tree care. I also have some slides just strictly on oak wilt if y'all are mainly interested in trying to learn more about oak wilt. And then I have this could just be really short. We could do this at the end about how to send good samples to the plant lab. So we'll probably do that one regardless. So CSI, landscape diagnosis, tree myths, or oak wilt. Do any of those just call out that y'all want to do?
I vote CSI.
Okay. That was the one I was kind of thinking of. It's a good broad one. Can y'all see that, the slide?
Yes, ma'am.
All right. Okay, so like I said before, trying to diagnose plants is like being a detective. So this is just being playful with that CSI Plant Detective Unit. So we'll talk a little bit about IPM, and then we'll just go into looking at a bunch of pictures of plant problems. So the number one thing to know is what's normal. What is normal for your plant? And that might sound silly or overly simplified, but sometimes we might have a unique cultivar of a plant that has a different color to it, or it has something different and unique about it when compared to other plants that you're more familiar with. And so it's important to know, what should your plant look like? What does it look like when it's healthy? Just for an example, one time someone sent me a picture of their aloe vera plant and it was blooming. And aloe veras can bloom, but they had never seen it bloom. It's not the most common thing for an aloe vera to bloom just as a house plant. And so when it first started to come out, this person knew it was different. They didn't know what was going on. They thought something might be wrong. And so they sent a picture in asking what was wrong with the plant. Well, it's just blooming. That's perfectly normal. That's a good thing. That's okay. So know what's normal for the plant and what's not normal that plant should not be doing. Then if the plant is not normal, then is it a biotic cause or an abiotic cause? Now I've used other words like infectious or non-infectious, or pathogen or environmental. So just kind of interchanging a lot of different terms. But what it comes down to is it biotic, meaning living? The word biotic just means from something living, or abiotic. Abiotic is non-living. So abiotic could be any other thing like environmental, herbicide, weather, compacted soil, and things like that. And then when it comes to insects, I don't think we'll get into the insect side of it because we're just focusing on plant pathology and not entomology. But if you do see insects, if you're out trying to investigate and diagnose what's going on and you see insects, you need to determine, like when you see a particular insect, is that insect helpful, harmful, or harmless? Because a lot of insects are helpful and we need them. A lot of them are harmless and they're not doing any harm. And then some are harmful. And it's important to correctly identify before you just, try and kill them just because you see it out in your garden or your yard. Well, I'm stuck. There we go. So IPM, I mentioned that with integrated disease management, they're kind of the same thing. IPM is integrated pest management, and it focuses on insect pests more. But if a plant is sick, I mean, before I only focused on abiotic and biotic diseases, but if you're just trying to diagnose what's wrong with a plant, it may be an insect. And entomology is a whole separate science. You may have a class on entomology that you've already had or that you will have. So that's a whole separate thing to study about insects. But if you just see a plant that's sick, as a plant pathologist or as someone that's just trying to identify and diagnose a plant, it may be insects. So I have sent in samples to the disease lab because I couldn't figure out what it was, and they were able to look at it under a high-power microscope, and they found little tiny mites that I couldn't see. Even though I have a microscope here in the office, it's not very high powered, and I probably could have found them. It just never occurred to me that would have been a mite. And so even the plant disease lab, they're going to look for everything possible, whether it's an insect or an infectious disease or just something environmental. They're not as able to help with those, but they can try and help you. If they can't see a specific infectious disease, they'll try and figure out what is the problem. So for IPM, first step is scouting. Scouting is important for good plant care. Whether you're scouting for insects or you're scouting for diseases or you're just out there, it's important to scout, and that just means intentionally looking at your plants. Just an observation of mine. I don't know how widespread this is, but I get phone calls sometimes, and people will say that their tree is sick all of a sudden. Like they just walked out today and the tree is suddenly sick. Now, that can be possible, like I said, for a fruit tree or something that could have a blight, or cotton root rot. Cotton root rot disease is very quick acting. But there have been times when when we were able to kind of work through what was wrong with the tree, and it didn't just happen overnight. But if you just get in a routine, like if it's your plant bed, your flower bed that you're walking past every day when you're going to work, or you're just out in the yard and you're not specifically looking to scout, it's easy to miss gradual decline or gradual changes. And then all of a sudden you do notice it. It's like, oh, when did that happen? So scouting just means intentionally inspecting your plants. So make a plan once a week to just go look in your vegetable garden, pick up your, pull up a tomato leaf and look on the underside of it. Look really closely at everything. Get out a hand lens and kind of look if you do see something funny on your plant. So scouting can help you catch things early and correctly identifying the problem. Again, at least for me personally, that's the hard part of all of this, is correct identification. That's what this whole thing is about, because it's really hard to diagnose plants. If a plant is sick, it can be hard to diagnose. Not always. Sometimes it's a pretty easy, obvious answer, but often it's not so easy. So action threshold, that is another step of IPM that has more to do with agricultural crops. So action threshold is just the level at which the cost to treat is equal to the cost of the damage, the value that you're losing in damage. If you're starting to have but again, that applies more to a commercial crop because you're just focusing on the financial side of it. If you have a pest in your crop and it costs such, $100 an acre to treat it, but so far the pest is only causing $25 an acre loss, it's not worth it. It's the expense of treating. But if you go over the threshold and you're losing more than it costs to treat, then you would treat it. But for a landscape, you just kind of have to figure out your own action threshold. So a lot of times in our yards, we want everything to look perfect, and you don't want anything to not be perfect. Or maybe you're okay with things looking not great for a while because you don't want to use any pesticides. So you got to find your own action threshold. Is it worth treating or not? It might have a lot to do with the specific pest. If you know that you have really bad spider mite problems and every summer you really start fighting those spider mites in the summer, then your action threshold will be a lot lower for that versus something that it comes along and it doesn't really cause a lot of damage and you're okay with it just taking its course. So have a system or a plan for scouting, know what your plant should look like, and take lots of notes. So here's a little flow chart. Is there a plant problem? Yes or no? If yes, is it biotic or abiotic? If it's biotic or from a living factor, is it a pathogen disease or is it an insect pest? And then if it's abiotic, could it be chemical or environmental or mechanical? Now this is not 100% going to, this is not a 100% method, but as a guideline, you can look at the damage on the plant. If the damage is not uniform and it's getting worse over time, it will tend to be more of a biotic cause. So uniform, just meaning, is it evenly, is it evenly spread throughout the plant or not? And is it getting worse over time or not? So if it's not uniform and it's getting worse over time, then it may be a biotic cause, like a disease. But if the damage is uniform and it's not worsening over time, then it may be more likely to be abiotic. So maybe it's a nutrient deficiency. And, a nutrient deficiency, some nutrients are mobile and some are not. So it may be that it's only the new growth, but it's going to be all the new growth. So it's going to be uniform. It might not be the whole plant, but you can see patterns of uniformity. Like maybe it's the old growth or maybe it's the new growth if it's a nutrient problem. And then it's in need of fertilizer or nutrition. So again, some of those abiotic causes, again, it could be damage from weather, wind, drought. It could be chemical, like a atrazine weed killer. It could be improper planting. It could be a person with a weed eater. Mechanical damage is just some kind of physical thing. Let's try and avoid that as much as possible. Don't get too close with the weed eater. Environmental could be like a lightning strike or flooding. Chemical would be like nutritional, like just it could be nutritional, like it's needed nutrients, or it could be a phytotoxic substance like a herbicide. Again, be real careful with weed and feed products. Some weed and feeds have a pre-emergent that is not going to hurt trees, but some weed and feeds have atrazine or other herbicides that could hurt trees. And they'll say in the label, the product will say, if it can be damaging to trees, it will say, do not apply around the rooting zone of trees and shrubs. But we don't always read the labels very well, so just be sure and always read labels of anything you're putting out on your plants. Many of our beloved garden plants can be real susceptible to those. So cultural, again, we've mentioned some of those, like soil compaction. If it's a new construction home that had a lot of equipment running around, that can be a big problem for plant roots trying to grow. Girdling roots, mulching practices can all have an impact. So let's dive in here. So I'm not sure how y'all want to do this. My screen is completely taken up with my slideshow, so I can't see the chat box. So I don't know if y'all want to put notes in there, and then somebody can tell me what is there, or if y'all just want to unmute yourself. We can have this be a discussion, or if you just want me to talk, I'm good with that too. It's whatever y'all want to do. I'm just going to show you some pictures, and we can talk about what's going on here.
I don't see a chat box.
Has the ability to mute and unmute, turn video off and on, and then there's you click on it.
It said eggs.
So on the right and left, these are two different plants. So these are this is one slide, but they're two examples. Now on the left is a fern. So knowing that it's a fern, does that give you any more insight?
Someone said not normal. And then
So-
another person said normal.
Yeah. So if you've grown ferns before, or if you remember from your maybe if you had a botany type lesson, some plants make spores. So we have angiosperms that make flowers, we have gymnosperms that make cones, and we have sporophytes like ferns that make spores. They don't make a fruit, they don't make a big seed. The ferns and a few other sporophytes, they make spores. And something else to consider when you're trying to diagnose plants, if things are all lined up real evenly, it's usually not going to be a pathogen or a biotic thing. So it's either going to be the plant doing it, like here. These are spores. This is just the fern reproducing. The fern has grown these spores. They're like little tiny microscopic seeds. And the fern has done that. It's perfectly normal. That's how ferns reproduce. So it's on the undersides of the leaves. The ferns grow and they develop these spores. So the spores can fly in the air and go elsewhere and grow more ferns. And you'll notice how they're all lined up like that. If you see in a tree, if you see lots of holes in your tree, and those holes are in lines or in grids, sometimes people think that they are borer holes from a beetle. But borer beetles are never going to be lined up. They're only going to be randomly scattered. So if you have holes in a tree trunk lined up, that's going to be a bird. It's like a sapsucker or a woodpecker or something like that. So patterns are really important to notice and look for. On the right, that is a blackberry leaf. So just knowing what you know about blackberry plants, are they an angiosperm, a gymnosperm, or a sporophyte? Is this normal for a blackberry to have those?
No. Oh.
So this particular disease, this is a disease. This is called blackberry rust. So like I said before, it's an orange in color, so they call it a rust, and it's on a blackberry. So, you know, plant pathologists get real creative with their naming of diseases, but it's blackberry rust. And so it's very, very particular to blackberries. That's why it's named that. And that's not a good thing. That's going to be reducing your crop productivity on your blackberry. So that would be something to control, while on the left is perfectly normal. What about this one? Any of you have pecans?
That's bad.
Right, that is bad. This is not normal. Anyone know what it is?
Black spot.
No, or no.
Powdery mildew.
Those are all good guesses. This particular, though, this is called pecan scab. Have y'all ever heard of pecan scab before? It's a fungal disease.
Oh.
And it can affect the nuts, and it can also affect the leaves. So it's a fungal disease, and this particular kind of fungal disease, once you see it, you can't really control it. Like we talked about before, a lot of diseases can't just be fixed. You can't just spray this and fix it. Those black spots are not going to turn green again. So it won't necessarily destroy your crop. If it's just a light infestation, you'll still get probably a good crop if everything else is all good. But it might reduce your productivity. So if you deal with black spot, pecan scab, the best bet is to preventatively treat early in the season with a preventative fungicide. But this particular disease is more active in more humid climates. We do have some of it in San Angelo, but it's not a constant problem. So y'all probably don't have it as a constant problem either. But we do have it, you know, every so often if we have a rainy spring. Okay, so here are some geranium leaves. Normal or not normal? So this is an unhealthy plant. It should not look like this. This is a nutrient deficiency. A real common nutrient deficiency we have here in West Texas is iron deficiency, because our soil pH is so high that the plants cannot get the iron from the soil. So iron deficiency is real common in alkaline soils, and the classic symptom is interveinal chlorosis. Interveinal just meaning that it's between the veins, and chlorosis is the term for yellow plant tissue that should be green. Necrosis, another term, necrosis is brown dead plant tissue. And so you might hear, so with oak wilt, a common symptom in live oaks is veinal necrosis. So the veins are brown and around the veins is still green and fine. For iron deficiency, it's interveinal chlorosis. So the veins are fine, but around the veins are yellow. And so just kind of recognizing veinal, interveinal, chlorosis, necrosis can help you with diagnosing plants. So this is just a nutrient deficiency, and improving the soil with some compost or using some fertilizer would likely help that plant. What does this one look like? Is this normal or is this not normal, for this particular leaf?
That's what I use.
Someone said it looks like a rust.
Okay, that's a good one, because it does have an orange color to it, but I'm afraid it's not. It's not a fungal disease. It's not a disease at all, actually. Any other guesses? This would be an important time to look on the underside of the leaf. So that's another clue. This particular pest that lives under the leaf. The symptom is called stippling. So stippled leaves, I think different things. I think there are other things that can cause stippling, but probably to me the most common pest that causes stippling is spider mite. So stippling, to me, it looks kind of like it has a sandblasted look on the outer part of the leaf, and the spider mites are living on the underside of the leaf. So this is a spider mite infected leaf. You cannot see the spider mites from this view, but you can see the stippling. So it's important, again, be sure and look under your leaves when you're scouting to catch things early, to catch those spider mites before they get out of control. When you look under the leaf, they're still really hard to see. You can't really see them in detail just with your naked eye. So a hand lens is always a really good thing to have. Also, you can get a white sheet of paper and shake the leaf over it, and then look really closely at the paper. And if you see little dark specks moving around, then it's probably spider mites. What about this leaf?
What the heck was that called?
This one's kind of a trick question.
That they said not normal.
That's correct. It's not normal. I say it's a trick question because it's not normal, but it's not bad. These are eggs of a beneficial insect. These are lacewing, green lacewing eggs.
Oh.
So if you look really carefully out in your yard, sometimes you can see these on your plant leaves, and if you do, that's a really good thing, because green lacewings are really beneficial insects. They're good, and they lay their eggs like this on the leaf. Pretty unique in how they do that. So it's not really the plant. It's not exactly normal, quote, normal for the plant, but it's not a bad thing at all. What about this? This is in the vegetable garden. This is a cucumber plant. Any of you grow a cucumber that should look like that?
No.
Right, so this is not normal. Have any of you had this disease? This is a fungal disease. This is called downy mildew. It's a pretty common fungal disease. This is one of the kinds of diseases that can be more broad and get on different kinds of plants pretty easily. But what about this one? Does this look normal or not normal? It looks pretty funky to me, but the name of the plant might give you a clue. This plant is called leopard plant. So if you know the name of the plant, that might Like, oh, okay, well, that's what it's supposed to look like. So this is normal for this plant, although if I saw that kind of pattern on some other kind of plant that was supposed to be green, a solid green, I would definitely, think something was wrong. But this particular plant is called leopard plant, and that is what the variegated leaves look like for it. Here's
Okay.
another pecan tree. Should pecan leaves look like that?
No.
That
No.
is correct. No, they should not. Pecan leaves should just be a nice solid green. And in this case, you can see both
Iron.
the damage they're causing and you can see the actual pest. So y'all know what those are?
Little black aphids.
Yes, that is black pecan aphid. Black pecan aphid in particular has a classic symptom of these yellow and dead splotches on the leaves. So pecans can get other kinds of aphids, yellow aphids and other aphids that just have a sticky honeydew, but black pecan aphid is more particular with this actual damage to the leaf that they can cause. Okay, here's an
Oh, my
oak
word.
tree. Should trees look like that?
Only the wicked one.
Heck no. Someone said squirrel.
Oh, hey, squirrel's a really good guess. It's not squirrel, but squirrels definitely can damage trees. They can damage branches. It's called flagging. I think I might have a picture of that later. And they can pull off bark. So they definitely can damage trees a bit. This is a more
Hail?
serious. Sorry?
Hail?
This is actually a disease. This is called hypoxylin canker. This is just one way that it can look. You can just do a Google search for hypoxylin canker and see the different ways that it can manifest itself. So, I mean, it kind of looks like lightning or hail, like you said. It looks like it could be some physical damage, but hypoxylin canker can cause damage to the trunk, to the bark and stuff. And the thing about hypoxylin canker is it's another one of those opportunistic diseases. Like I mentioned with take all root rot of the lawn, take all root rot pathogen is always out there, but if it makes your lawn sick will depend on, stress of the grass, and stressful conditions mean it can take over. And so hypoxylin canker is similar. Stressed trees get hypoxylin canker. So if you keep your trees healthy and you do everything right, you give them the right, you water them if needed, and you take good care of them. You don't do any improper pruning. You prune correctly, then you're not likely to get hypoxylin. But stress trees that are damaged from something else can get hypoxylin canker. And there's not really, to my knowledge, I don't think there's any kind of a cure for it. It's just a slow decline. Okay, what is this?
Those.
This is just one manifestation. There's lots of different kinds of ways that this can look on different plants. And I think I mentioned before when I was talking about galls that galls could be from a disease or an insect. So these are galls. These in particular are insect galls. It's a tree own tissue growing in an abnormal way on the leaf, but it's growing that way because an insect laid their egg there, and it's growing up around the insect. Now, bacterial disease galls are damaging to the plants. They're very contagious. You don't want to have something like crown gall, for example. You do not want to have in your plants, but insect galls are essentially harmless. They don't hurt the tree. They may look ugly if you have a lot of them, but there's not really anything to do about it because we can't really control them. The insects are protected inside there until they're ready to come out, and then they're gone. So not much you can do about them, but they don't hurt anything. Okay. I'm sorry, what was that? So here's a tomato plant. For any of you who have your tomatoes planted this year, do you Would you want your plant to look like that?
No.
Someone
Hornworm.
said tomato worm.
So yeah, a caterpillar like tomato hornworm could definitely do something similar, but this is not an insect. There's a clue.
Is it wilt?
No.
Nope, it is a disease, but it's not fungal. So this is what a virus can look like in a tomato. A tomato virus causes distorted growth. So in this case, it's not a real great picture. Sorry. It can definitely look like the leaves were just eaten away and stripped off, but the plant actually grew this way. This is how the plant grew out. They grew these long, stringy leaves and twisted and curled up. It grew that way.
Huh.
And that's what a virus can do to a tomato. And there's no cure for a virus. So remember, the thing to do is just get it out of there, get it rogued out. So here's maybe a neighbor who comes to talk to you about their tree. They've got little dead twigs from the canopy that are hanging up in the tree, or they're falling on the ground, and they're whittled down to a point, and it happens in the fall. Do any of you know what that would be? I'm sorry, I thought I heard something. What was that?
Carpenter worm.
Okay, yeah, it is an insect. So this one we call it a girdler beetle. So a carpenter worm might be another name for it also. I call it girdler beetle. And the female, she chews around and girdles small twigs, and she lays her eggs on the part that's going to fall down. And so the eggs are in there. She chews it off, it falls on the ground, and so then those eggs overwinter, and then they go to reinfect later on. So the best, it's not really going to kill the tree. It's not really going to cause too much stress even, but if you don't like that it's happening, you can collect any branches that fall to the ground and destroy them so those eggs aren't there overwintering. We've talked about this one a bit. What is this disease?
Oh, well.
Yeah, I hope none of you have to ever see this in your own yard. It's really devastating to lose oak trees. So I don't think we're not going to have time to just do the whole oak wilt lesson. We're almost out of time actually, but just a few points to make about oak wilt. Prune in the winter, even in the hot part of the summer if you have to, but not in the spring or the fall. There's a tiny beetle called the Nidadulid beetle. This beetle is like the size, if you picture a dime, if you picture how large a dime is, the letters on the dime, I forget what the dime specifically says, what letters are on there, but the letters on a dime, this beetle is about that long. This is much smaller than a dime. This beetle is the size of the letters on a dime. So it's a very small beetle. You can't really see it flying around. But this beetle, it likes, red oak trees will make a fungal mat. Live oaks do not. Live oaks die from oak wilt, but they do not make the fungal mat that can continue the life cycle. They can spread through roots to other live oaks and other oaks nearby. It can spread that way, but live oaks do not make the fungal mat. Red oaks make a fungal mat just under the bark. It's the mass of the fungal spores. This little beetle is attracted to that smell. They like the fungal mat, so they'll crawl on it and get spores on them. They also like the smell of a fresh oak cut. So if they have spores on them and you prune your tree in the spring, the beetle will fly to your fresh cut tree and infect your tree through that opening, that wound. So if you prune when those beetles are not active, you're better off. Also paint your cuts. We don't recommend a thick, heavy, tarry pruning sealant at all for any tree, but for oak trees, we do recommend to paint the cuts. You can just use a cheap latex spray paint. You're not doing anything other than masking the smell so that insect doesn't infect your tree. Sterilize your tools, or if you're hiring someone to prune, make sure that they have sterilized their tools, and then just be aware that live oaks can spread through root grass very easily. So if one live oak gets it, nearby trees will likely also, and trenching can help a lot but trenching is not an option for neighborhoods. But if you have land, it is more of an option for that. If you have more questions on oak wilt, I'm sure Jeanette can help you, or I can answer questions about that. Just want to quickly go through a few more of these pictures before we run out of time. This is that one I mentioned before called cedar apple rust. And this is the cedar stage. Even though technically we don't have cedars, we have junipers. We call it cedar apple rust because we call our junipers cedar trees. But this is cedar apple rust. It starts out with this big, weird looking gelatinous form, and it hardens and dries out into the right side. My brother was in, I think, Austin once, and he saw it and he sent me a picture. He's like, "What is this? It looks like an alien. It looks really weird." But it is cedar apple rust, and it has 2 alternate hosts. It gets on apple and apple family trees in one season, and it gets on these cedars in the other season. So here's another example of something real lined up and even. So you remember when we were looking at that fern, I said if something's really all lined up and even, it's probably not from a biotic cause, like an insect or a disease. So what do y'all think happened here?
Someone said fertilizer. Fertilizer.
So in a way, I guess you could say this is a biotic cause because this is a person. A person did this by accident. So yes, a person did this either. I'm thinking it could be fertilizer. Like if you apply a nitrogen fertilizer over wet grass, you can scorch the plant tissue. So I don't know if they went back and forth with a drop spread or a fertilizer. It looks like that's what they may have done. Either that or they mowed it too low and scalped it, but kind of in an uneven way, like one half of the mower was too low. So to be honest, I'm not sure if it was fertilizer or bad mowing, but it was definitely a person going back and forth. It's not a disease or an insect that would look like that. So here's a holly shrub. This is just normal variegation. So a lot of hollies have solid green leaves, and this holly is variegated. So sometimes you have variegated varieties where you'll have this different coloration in the leaves. This is the powdery mildew. And this is black spot of Indian hawthorn. This is leaf miner damage. This is an insect. It tunnels through the leaf. It doesn't really hurt the plant too much. It just makes it look bad. So if this is in your landscape, we want our plants to look good. So even though it doesn't kill the plant or stress it too much, it is good just to pick those off. Just pick off the leaf that you see it and throw it away so that you don't have it continuing to damage your leaves like that.
Burn it.
Yep. All right, so lastly, I just wanted to show you real quick some of the suggestions for sending samples in to the lab. So are y'all able to see the new slide, proper sampling?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah.
All righty,
Yes.
so the plant lab is very helpful if you're stumped, if you can't figure out what's going on. And especially if you're stumped, but you think it's the biotic cause and you're just not sure. And they're also really helpful at confirming, like really important diagnoses. Like if you think you have oak wilt and it seems pretty obvious, I would still send a sample to confirm that they can detect oak wilt, because that's kind of a big deal, because it does affect everybody and everyone's trees in the area. And so either if you're stumped and you can't figure it out, but you do think it's a fungal disease or something, a bacterial disease, or if you're pretty sure what it is, but you just want a confirmation, it's a good resource. So I'm going to tell you what, this is from Sheila McBride. She runs the lab there, and these are her slides. So I'm going to share her point of view. My point of view in a nutshell, if you're sending samples to anybody, if you're bringing, something there to the extension office where you are, or if people bring me samples to my office, what I like to say is if it's an insect, it needs to be dead, and if it's a plant, it needs to be alive. So if you're bringing an insect, it probably needs to be dead. We just don't like to get living bed bugs, that kind of thing, Nobody wants to be handed some live bed bugs, for example. So whatever you're trying to identify, just seal it up in a baggie and throw it in the freezer for a while and kill the insect. When I was new and I just started my job, somebody brought me it was just a little pill bottle. It was opaque and you couldn't see. And I was gone. They just left it at my desk. And it said, please ID. So I opened the bottle and the thing flew away. It was totally gone. I could not get it. And that person was really mad. It was so hard to catch that thing. And they were really mad that I lost it, but had to open bottles. So if it's like some aphids or something that's not a big deal, like I don't mind people bringing me a baggie with a leaf and a bunch of aphids in there. But best practice is that they're dead. But plants need to be alive, because y'all know what a diagnosis of a dead plant is?
Dead.
It's dead. That's the diagnosis. That's all the diagnosis that we're going to get from a dead plant. So if you're trying to figure out what's wrong with the plant, don't bring the dead stuff. Bring in the living part that's showing something, showing a symptom. And so it's the same for the lab. So the best, if you're going to take a sample, you can go to that website, plantclinic.tamu.edu, and you can print out the form. The form has all those instructions, and you just follow those instructions. You take a sample of the transition area where there's dead branches and perfectly live and healthy branch. In the middle somewhere, there's going to be symptoms but still alive. So you have to send them living plant matter, but it needs to be showing the symptoms. Try and send them the entire plant if you can. That's usually not possible, because usually we're sending them a tree branch or a shrub or something like that. But if it's your turf grass, you can send a whole sample of the leaves and the roots and everything. You can send a whole core of turf. But if you're worried, it's good to, if you can't take the whole plant, it is good to send them a little bit of the roots also, along with the branch. Fill out the form completely, as much as you can, and even send pictures. If you can send a couple of pictures, that can help them a lot. So this is a bad sample. It's just dead. There's not really anything they can do with that. A good sample is showing, you can see that some of it was still alive and green, but definitely lots of symptomatic tissue on there. And so on the right there, you have a palm tree that again was still alive, but they took a good sample, they packed it up well. Good practice would be to send your sample with the quickest method possible in the early part of the week, like a Monday or a Tuesday, not in the middle or end of the week, because if you send it later in the week, it might sit in the post office or in the UPS shipping, over the whole weekend. So try and get them the sample as quick as possible. Even when you take a good sample and you pack it right, you still want it to get there quickly. And pictures are really helpful, but not if they're not good pictures. So it needs to be in focus. You need to be able to see the important parts of the plant, see the whole plant. If you don't want to send a whole sample, you can just send them a picture. You can just email a picture. If you email a picture, don't just say, like this right on the right here, they just sent that and they say, what is this? If you're going to send a picture request, make sure you tell them what the plant is, what is the name of the plant, any important factors about the plant, like is it newly planted, or, is it just any kind of important information you can think of, but especially what is the name of the plant and where are you located, where is this plant growing, and make sure that it's in focus. So good photos show lots of good information. They show the whole plant and close-ups. It's really good to have an overall view and a close-up of the concern that you have. So this sample, they sent a good sample because it has symptoms but still alive, and they showed some good pictures with it. So I think I am out of time. I think that was the main stuff that I wanted to show you. So this is their website, plantclinic.tamu.edu. It's really helpful for diagnosing if you get stumped. There's a form. You click on the tab there that says submission forms, and it has all those instructions. So I am out of time. So if there are a couple of last questions I could answer, or if you would like, you can email me. Let me see if I can. put my email address up here somewhere. It's aewatkins@ag.tamu.edu. Y'all can see that. So I think that's all I have. Thank y'all so much for listening. And I sent the slides on so Jeanette can get you that slideshow. And I hope y'all have a good rest of the weekend.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Allison. If you
Thank
are
you.
a trainee, just remember to click that link for the class that starts at 12. So yeah, the trainees will have an email with the link for the class that starts at 12, and I'll see you guys in an hour.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Everyone
bye.
have a good weekend.
Classes,
You do too.
from classes, I guess. Okay, do it.